The Battle of Goodenough Island, also known as Operation Drake, was a battle of the Pacific campaign of World War II. The Allies attacked the Kaigun Rikusentai stranded on Goodenough Island, Papua, during the Battle of Milne Bay to deny the Japanese the ability to use the island prior to the Buna campaign. Drake Force, consisting of the Australian 12th Battalion and attachments, landed on the southern tip of Goodenough Island at Milne Bay and Talabar Bay on the 22nd of October, and following a short but heavy fight, the Japanese forces withdrew to Ferguson Island on the 27th of October. After the battle, Goodenough Island was developed by the Allies and became a major base which they used for further operations later in the war. Background: Goodenough Island is the northernmost of the D'Entrecasteaux Islands. To the northeast are Papua, separated by the 15-mile-wide Wartunt Strait. The island is located 65 miles by sea from Milne Bay and 185 miles from Port Moresby. It lies along the sea route between Buna and Milne Bay and was therefore strategically important during late 1942. The island is roughly oval-shaped, measuring 21 miles long and 13 miles across. The coastal belt is up to 5 miles in width, covered in grasslands and dissected by streams and coastal swamps. The island rises sharply to the central summit of Mount Vinuo, 8,000 feet above sea level, while the western side of the island was covered in rainforest and jungle. There were grassy plains on the northeastern side covered in kunai and kangaroo grass. These were suitable sites for airfield development, but the best anchorages were at Milne Bay on the southeastern side, Talabar Bay on the southwestern, and Belly Bay on the eastern side. Other sites could only accommodate shallow draft vessels drawing 12 feet or less, were obstructed by coral reefs, or were exposed to the weather, thus making them unsuitable for development. The island had no roads, and there was no motor or animal transport. Neither the interior of the island nor the surrounding waters were adequately charted in 1942. Important features were often missing from maps, and some features had different spellings. Aircraft and ships headed from Milne Bay to Buna and vice versa had to pass close by Goodenough Island, so an Allied presence on the island could provide warning of Japanese operations while denying the Japanese the opportunity to observe Allied ships and aircraft. Goodenough Island also had flat areas suitable for the construction of emergency airstrips. Prelude. In early August 1942, a small detachment of an American fighter control squadron had been stationed on Goodenough Island to provide advance warning to the Australian fighters based at Milne Bay. On the 7th of August, 5 Royal Australian Air Force P-40 Kitty Hawks of No. 76 Squadron made forced landings on the grassy plains. After makeshift airstrips were cut through the grass, 4 of them were able to be flown out again. On the 24th of August, 7 landing craft carrying 353 Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces troops of the 5th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, supplemented by a few engineers of the 14th and 15th Pioneer Units, set out from Cape Nelson in the dark to participate in the attack on the Allied forces at Milne Bay. Upon reaching Goodenough Island, they were unable to locate a suitable hiding place for their landing craft during the day, and they had to be left on the beach, where they were discovered by the Allies. Their movement was reported by a coastwatcher at Cape Nelson, and a report was received at Milne Bay around midday on the 25th of August that they were on the west coast of Goodenough Island. 9 Kitty Hawks from No. 75 Squadron RAF were dispatched to investigate. They located the landing craft and destroyed all 7, along with the Japanese forces' radio and most of its stores. 8 Japanese were killed in the raid. The survivors, lacking transport, were stranded. Meanwhile, the American detachment on Goodenough Island destroyed its radios and withdrew from the island. News of what had occurred on Goodenough Island reached the Japanese command on the 9th of September via an orderly who had made his way back to Buna in a canoe. The destroyer Yayoi and Isakaza set out from Rabaul to rescue the men on Goodenough Island on the 10th of September. They were sighted by Allied aircraft the next day. The destroyers are Selfridge, Bagley, Henley and Helm were detached from Task Force 44 under Captain Cornelius W. Flynn, USN, to intercept. They did not locate the Japanese destroyers, but 5 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses did. Isakaza escaped despite a near miss, but Yayoi sank after taking a direct hit on the stern that set her on fire. Her survivors reached Normanby Island, where they found themselves in a similar predicament to the Japanese on Goodenough Island that they had originally set out to rescue. After the attack, Isakaza returned to the area where Yayoi had gone down, finding an oil slick, but no survivors. On the 22nd of September, Isakaza returned again, this time with the destroyer Mochizuki, and together they found 10 survivors in a launch. The 2 destroyers then searched the coast of Normanby Island without success. However, the next day another 10 survivors were spotted by a patrol plane and they were rescued on the 26th of September. The presence of shipwrecked Japanese sailors on Normanby Island presented no military threat to the Allied forces at Milne Bay, but Captain A. T. Timperley, the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit officer responsible for the D'Entrecasteaux and Trebriand Islands, argued that they posed a threat to the native population and Australia's reputation as its protector. As a result, C Company 2, 10th Infantry Battalion, under the command of Captain J. Broxop, was ordered to land on Normanby Island, leaving Gilly Gilly on the destroyer HMAS Stuart on the 21st of September. Broxop's company landed at Nadi Nadi on the 22nd of September, and experienced no opposition. It took 8 Japanese as prisoners before returning to Milne Bay on Stuart on the 23rd of September. Meanwhile, messages and food supplies had been airdropped by the Japanese to the troops on Goodenough on 10 and the 12th of September. On the 3rd of October, the submarine I-1 arrived at Goodenough Island, and dropped off rations, ammunition, medical supplies, a radio and a landing craft. It took 71 sick or wounded men, all it could carry, back to Rabaul, along with the bodies of 13 dead. This left 285 Japanese troops on the island, most of whom were suffering from malaria. I-1 returned on the 13th of October with more rations and medical supplies, and a second landing craft, but was driven off by an Allied aircraft that dropped a flare. On the 15th of October, they received a radio message warning that the Allies were showing considerable interest in Goodenough Island and were likely to invade. The Allied Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area, General Douglas MacArthur, issued new orders on the 1st of October. Our forces in the Southwest Pacific Area will attack with the immediate objective of driving the Japanese to the northward of the Kumusa River line. The New Guinea force will advance along the axes Noro-Kokoda Wairopi and Rigodora Bisilo Jayo Wairopian, or Abau Namudi Jayo Wairopi Trail, both inclusive, with the objective of securing the line of the Kumusa River from Awalamab Divide to the crossing of the Kokoda Buna Trail, both inclusive. Occupy and hold Goodenough Island and the north coast of southeastern New Guinea south of Cape Nelson in such forces to deny these areas to the Japanese forces. Upon securing these objectives, all land forces will prepare for further advance to secure the area Bunagona upon further orders of this headquarters. Battle. As part of an operation codenamed Drake, the 12th Infantry Battalion, a 2nd Australian Imperial Force unit from the 18th Infantry Brigade, which was composed mainly of men from Queensland and Tasmania, was selected to invade Goodenough Island. Its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Arnold, as the commander of Drake Force, was ordered to destroy the Japanese force there, re-establish the coast watching and radar warning posts, and reconnoiter the island for airfield sites. Intelligence reports indicated that there were approximately 300 Japanese troops on the island. mainly concentrated in the Galai War Bay Kilia mission area in the southeast. The Japanese were believed to be short of food and ammunition, and suffering from malnutrition and disease. Boarding the destroyers HMAS Stuart and Arunta on the 22nd of October, the Australian troops were transported to Goodenough Island escorted by Task Force 44. Arriving that night, the battalion disembarked on both sides of the island's southern tip. It was planned to trap the Japanese between the main force of 520 troops, commanded by Arnold, which landed at Mud Bay, and a smaller force of 120 men, mostly from C Company, commanded by Major Keith Gatewood, which landed at Talabar Bay, about 6 miles away. Australian landing craft were unavailable, but the 12th Infantry Battalion had 3 ketches, the Matoma, McLaren King and Tirio, 3 Japanese landing craft that had been captured in the Battle of Milne Bay, and 2 powered whaleboats. 7 days' rations were carried on these craft, and another 7 days on the 2 destroyers. Each man carried 3 days' rations. Drake Force had 2-hour 3B wireless sets for maintaining communication with Milne Force. One was taken to Mud Bay while the other remained on Arunta. 2 Army No. 101 wireless sets enabled battalion headquarters to communicate with Mud Bay. In addition, each company had an Army No. 108 wireless set to talk to battalion headquarters. The Mud Bay force traveled in Arunta and came ashore at 2300 in the McLaren King, 2 of the ship's launches, the 3 Japanese landing craft and the 2 powered whaleboats. A base was established ashore at Mud Bay, where a dressing station was prepared and heavy equipment, including all but one 2-inch mortar per company, was cached. The Australians then set out on a grueling march to Kilia. As they did so, a violent thunderstorm broke, and it started to rain heavily. The force pushed on toward Kilia, but made slow progress that night due to the steep terrain and heavy rain. They were still half a mile from Kilia at 8:30 on the 23rd of October, when they encountered the Japanese. The Australians were crossing a creek behind which was a steep hill. The Japanese commander waited until the Australians were almost at his position before opening fire with machine guns and mortars. The troops who had crossed the creek found hand grenades were being rolled down the hill at them. Those behind it were pinned down by heavy and accurate fire. Arnold decided to pull back. That night, he formed a defensive position, and beat off a small Japanese counterattack. Meanwhile, the Talabar Bay force, which traveled on Stuart, and came ashore in Tirio, a ship's launch and a ship's whaleboat, was ashore by 3:30 on the 23rd of October. They captured a Japanese machine gun position at about 600. 2 platoons went south where they were engaged by Japanese forces. The Japanese were driven beyond Nilubilu Creek, but a heavy Japanese counterattack from the north at 900 inflicted casualties on the Australians and forced him to withdraw from the area. Gatewood broke radio silence and attempted to contact Arnold on the 108 set, but was unable to reach him. After this, they came under heavy mortar and machine gun fire, which inflicted heavy casualties, having lost 6 men killed and 10 wounded, with 3 more posted as missing. The Australians were forced to fall back under pressure from the pursuing Japanese. Lieutenant Clifford Hoskins would later receive the Military Cross for silencing a Japanese machine gun in the ensuing fighting. Faced with being overrun, Gatewood withdrew his force even further, at first back to Talabar Bay, and then to Mud Bay aboard Stuart. Arriving on the 24th of October, Gatewood could not get through on the radio because the petrol generator that supplied power to the radios at Mud Bay had broken down, thereby cutting Arnold's link with Mud Bay, Milne Force and Talabar Bay. Arnold launched an attack on Kilia at 9:10, supported by two 3-inch mortars and 100 rounds that had been brought up from Milne Bay. A promised airstrike failed to arrive. Instead, Japanese aircraft strafed the Australian positions, as well as the ketch McLaren King in Milne Bay. It had some wounded men on board, and further casualties were caused. Arnold attempted a flanking movement with A Company, but it became lost in the jungle. The attack then became a frontal one against the main Japanese defences, which Arnold chose not to press. With the Australian forces unable to advance, the Japanese were able to withdraw during the night. They were transported, along with their equipment and supplies, by the two landing craft to Ferguson Island, where they arrived at dawn on the 25th of October. From there, 261 men were collected by the light cruiser Tenryu the following day. The 12th Infantry Battalion then pressed on from Kilia to Galaiwai Bay, meeting no resistance and finding well-prepared but unmanned defences. The bombing and strafing of native villages by the Allied air forces caused some 600 Goodenough Islanders to flee to Ferguson Island, where Timperley's ANGAU detachment had set up a refugee camp, and cared for them until the fighting was over and they could safely return. Australian losses on Goodenough Island were 13 killed in action or died of wounds, and 19 wounded. The Japanese suffered 20 killed and 15 wounded during the battle, but the 12th counted 39 dead. However, this was only an estimate, as the Japanese had been able to retrieve and bury their dead, which had made it difficult for the Australians to accurately determine their casualties. Despite the evacuation, a number of Japanese were left behind. One was captured by Islanders on the 30th of October and handed over to Timperley. There was also a group of 3, of which 2 died from malaria in November 1942, and the third, Shigeki Yokote, was taken prisoner in July 1943.